Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Traveler. And it is my opinion, Traveler is the bluest tabletop role-playing game that has ever existed. It's recently become this. So before I get going, I'm going to give a political warning. So this video is about tabletop role-playing games, specifically the Traveler tabletop role-playing games, but I'm going to discuss other tabletop role-playing games and politics, American politics, red, blue, right? So those colors from the perspective of American politics, right? That's not everybody's jam. Not everybody wants to hear about TRPGs and politics. A lot of people specifically play tabletop role-playing games so they don't have to talk about politics. So here's your ripcord. Like, you can pull your ripcord now and go find other content, and that's totally okay. So I'm just giving a warning. This is about tabletop role-playing games and politics. If that's not your jam, there's I would suggest lots and lots of other cool things to watch on YouTube, right? It's like Complex does a sneaker shopping show. Go check that out. All right, okay. So blue. Let's define red and blue, all right? So I'm going to be using the terms red and blue. Any kind of political wonk will understand these terms. They're quick ways of identifying specific groups of political leanings within America. All right. So a person who would have the attribute red attached to them in America would have the following, would have a probability of having these attributes attached to them. They live in Omaha. They eat steak, and they drive a Ford F-150. Okay, that is a red. All right. Who is a blue? All right. A blue, okay, is someone who lives in Connecticut, eats tofu, and drives a Subaru Outback. All right. So actually, now that I defined those terms, good thing I defined those terms, because I'm gonna switch it. Traveler is the reddest possible tabletop role-playing game there is. Not blue, red. It is the reddest tabletop role-playing game that exists. And so just want to talk about this a little bit. So I think this recently happened where Traveler has become synonymous with red tabletop role-playing game. Also, just want to say, this is a total dog whistle. Not everybody who plays Traveler understands that Traveler is a red tabletop role-playing game. By the way, this is me saying this, nobody else, right? I don't think anybody else is saying, oh, I love Traveler because it's a super red tabletop role-playing game, right? I think there are people who understand that fundamentally and are going down that road with that understanding, but I don't think anybody's really claiming it or declaring it, right? And the reason why I'm declaring it today is I think it's interesting. I didn't realize it, right? So one, I like Traveler. I've always liked Traveler. But Traveler is definitely a billiards tabletop role-playing game, right? I love billiards, right? I love playing billiards. I really like pool, billiards and pool. I'm using them synonymously here. But I never really play it because there's just a million other cool things I like to do before I would do billiards. And Traveler is the same way. I've done 2 campaigns of Traveler. One back in the early 80s and one in the late 1990s. And I haven't played since, right? But I've recently been learning a lot about the Travel tabletop role-playing game. And I'll just share a little bit of the facts I know. So one, Traveler's had 3 major renditions. It's had the Mark Miller rendition. That's the creator of the game. The version of the game that Mark Miller created, okay? The version of the game that was under GURPS, so the Generic Universal Role-Playing System, GURPS, created quite a few Traveler books, okay? There's still and by the way, there are groups of people who play all 3 of these versions. And the Mongoose version. So Mongoose recognized the value of the Traveler games a while ago and actually bought them. And I think Traveler is with Mongoose right now, right? It's still being published by Mongoose right now. So you have GURPS, you have Mongoose, and you have Miller. Those are the 3 major renditions of the game. And by the way, I think all of them have fit this red attribute. It is the reddest tabletop role-playing game there is. Now, why is it that way? Well, the game talks about, so what is Traveler? Well, Traveler is the science fiction tabletop role-playing game. Well, you're about to say, oh, well, who cares? There's lots of science fiction tabletop role-playing games. Actually, there's not. There's very, very, very few science fiction tabletop role-playing games, right? There's science fantasy tabletop role-playing games, a ton of them, right? Starfinder is literally a fantasy tabletop role-playing game. The Star Wars tabletop role-playing game, every single version is a science fantasy tabletop role-playing game, right? Gamma World is science fantasy. All of these, and guess what? Eclipse Phase, right? A lot of people are going to like to hear this one. Absolute science fantasy, right? You know, like, that's like, oh, I'm going to take my consciousness out of this person and put it into somebody else, and like, there's absolutely no scientific evidence at all that anybody's going to be able to do that even 1,000 years from now, if ever, right? There's ideas within Eclipse Phase that are so, like, that belong in a Supers game, right? Like, yeah, so, but Traveler is really unique. It is about Type S shuttles. Your group has a Type S shuttle. You fly that shuttle around. You have to worry about fuel. You have to worry about every ship system in that shuttle. This is the primary thrust of the game. You can play it in different ways, but when you play Traveler, this is so you have a Type S shuttle. You're bouncing around between the Spinward Marches and the Third Imperium, and you haul freight from one star system to another star system. You get money. You make your ship better. You fight off pirates. Maybe you become a pirate. But the reality is, in this game, like, gravity matters. Your ships are going to have to spin. Fuel matters, right? This game actually, attempts to align itself with hard science fiction, right? And also, it treats space as a frontier, and that's where it really gets read, right? The idea that a person goes out onto the frontier, and with grit and pluck, carves out a business, right, and makes that business better, and then they get to reap the rewards of what they've worked hard for, right? Really, a lot of tabletop role-playing games are not, they are not dealing with this, right? They are dealing with, hey, I got a light sword, and I have the Force, or like, oh, I want to be a kitsune with a laser gun, riding a hover cycle, like, really, almost every tabletop role-playing out there really that even remotely comes close to science fiction is not a tabletop role-playing game about science fiction. It is a tabletop role-playing game about science fantasy. So Traveler really is one of the very few unique games that is a science fiction, a tabletop role-playing game that actually aligns with hard science fiction. And the reason why it's very read is it's actually very labor-based. It actually values labor, right? And it values mercantilism, and it values a lot of math, and actually thinking about space from a very realistic, from the most realistic of all the tabletop role-playing game perspectives, right? So it's really interesting that this happened, and here's another thing. I think this just happened, right? I think Mark Miller, really cared about making the game an actual science fiction game rather than a science fantasy game. I don't think he ever intended to make the game a red tabletop game, right? But then what happened is, because it was so unique and it actually lined up with red principles, I think red people were attracted to it, right? People who are on the red side of the political spectrum were attracted to it, and now it truly stands as the reddest tabletop role-playing game that exists, right? Now, what is the bluest? Now, if we now know what is the reddest tabletop role-playing game, and Traveler just kind of fell into the winning that championship, right? What is the bluest tabletop role-playing game? Well, nobody, who knows? And the reason why is that race is still being run, and there are a lot of contestants. Like, the number of people who are, very, I would say, blue as far as, their political leanings and design is incredibly high in tabletop role-playing games. And there really aren't a lot of people who are on the red side, right? In my opinion. You will not find a ton of tabletop role-playing game designers who are really leaning more toward red on the political spectrum than blue on the political spectrum. And so, so there's vicious competition to be the bluest tabletop role-playing game that there possibly is, right? And, but for red, I don't think it was even a competition. Like, Traveler just won because it was the only person standing over there on that side of the room, right? Which is really, really fascinating to me. So one of the things is, as I learn more about Traveler, the more I like it. I love the idea that this thing is so unique, and I actually am really getting spun up to see if I want to play Traveler. The other thing is, I'm very fortunate in that there's a major Traveler convention that's held every year up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is close to where I live, and really it's almost like a mecca for Traveler players. This specific convention. And I've really been considering very, very carefully attending that because it's right in my backyard. And if you care about Traveler, like some of the top names in Traveler are going to be there, which that's pretty cool. I think it's almost like a Gary Con of Traveler, right? So I really thinking about considering going to that, and I'm really excited to continue to learn more about Traveler. It's a really wonderful, special game. It has some really unique aspects to it. And I'm just really impressed overall with just what Traveler is, and I doff my cap to it winning the reddest tabletop role-playing game in existence award, because I really think that's what it's become, and it had a kind of unusual road to that, it's really unique and special. So I definitely check out start to learn about Traveler if you have some extra time. It really is a beautiful game. It's been around since 1977, which it's really wonderful. That's the year it was birthed, because of course that's exactly the same year that Star Wars was birthed, which I know, like, Star Wars is not a science fiction story. It's absolutely a science fantasy story. But, the Venn diagram covers both of those. So that's why I think that Traveler is the absolutely reddest tabletop role-playing game in existence. Take care.